God bless everybody. Tonight's May 7th, 2020, and we're having a full moon, super moon, flower moon event. It's exciting, and it's going to be the last one until April 2021. And that's going to be an important date, I believe, in my calendar of events that we're going to show you tonight. So, one thing I thought was interesting before we get into this, and then we can get into the timeline and the parable of the fig tree and the Daniel prophecies and how all this connects together, but I thought this was really interesting. Not only do we have a Comet Atlas event on May 23rd, but we had a comet, or we're going to have that on May 23rd, but we have a Comet Swan event on May 13th, right prior to that. And this is a comet that they just found, I believe, on April 11th of 2020. And guess what? That's when we had the Black Swan event in the markets. So is there a coincidence there? I don't know. We do know that these comets are signs, and we need to look at the signs and the blood moons and all these different things. But I thought that was an interesting thing. And again, today we have a supermoon event, which I thought was an interesting thing. That will not reoccur until April of next year. And so I want to show you how I believe that matters in my timeline. So this teaching is to show you the meaning and the timing of Daniel 8, Daniel 12, and Psalm 90:10, and how the 4 days, or the number of days that they're indicated 4 different times in those books of Daniel, are important. And the days that I'm talking about, or these dates that I'm talking about, are the 1260 days, the 1290 days, the 1335 days, and the 2300 days. These occur in Daniel 8 and 12, and they're important to understand how these dates work together with the Jewish calendar, and how I believe this is going to happen within that parable of the fig tree of Psalm 90:10. And like I said, that Psalm 90:10 is important because the state of Israel was proclaimed as a nation on May 14, 1948. Its basic generation of 70 years was fulfilled on May 14th of 2018, and the strong generation will be on May 14th of 2028. And I believe that God tells us that after that strong generation we will fly away, and that is within that time frame we will be raptured away on that last date of or before that, May 14, 2028, within the parable of the fig tree generation. So this is important. Again, I've said for a while, I believe that on Yom Kippur, or October 9th of 2019, Erdogan invaded Syria, and that was the breaking of the first seal. And by the time he gets to the Temple Mount in Israel, within the next 2 to 3 years, he will break that 6th seal. So it's important that we watch these events and watch Erdogan as a barometer, but we also have to watch all these other barometers. We have to watch these blood moons and these comets and all these signs to determine if what we're seeing is really happening in front of us. And most of us are waiting for that Daniel 8 event. We're waiting for the Kurds and the Medes to join Iran and Persia, and if that happens, then we should see Turkey run over there like a whirlwind and crush both of those kings. And if that's the case, Daniel 8 prophecy has been fulfilled, and I believe then we'll see that Joel 1 locust event start to invade Israel, and then we'll see these forming of these 10 nations, and by the time Erdogan gets to the Temple Mount, God will destroy him on the 6th seal. So why does this all add up, and how does it link with this this calendar or the timeline I put together. So I said Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, October 9th, 2019 was when the first seal was broken, I believe. And I believe that if we radiate this to the future, you'll see that these Hebrew Jewish calendar events really matter, and how that they culminate into these 4 dates or days that Daniel was talking about, and how they all link together. So we have to go to when, and like I say, this is all speculation based on my 50-some years of looking at this book. So you have to go out and look at this stuff and try to discern whether or not I'm reading this properly. But I believe that the things that I'm seeing here are important, and so we need to bring these up as watchmen, and so we need to inform the church and the people so that they know that these events might be happening in front of us, and if so, we have a better understanding, and that gives us hope that God's in control here, and so we can start to explain this to people, and they can also see that hope and get as many of them across the finish line as possible. So I then have to get you to understand this properly. Then we have to go back to when I believe the rapture occurs, and that's on the 7th trumpet. When Jesus returns on the 7th trumpet, which is the Feast of Trumpets on October 2nd and 3rd of 2027, I believe that is when the rapture of the elect saint and martyrs occur. Now, I've done a video prior to this about the sorrows and woes and how this all culminates with the Jewish calendar. So this isn't the first video I've done, but I want to explain this a little deeper. And so the first demarcation point that we have to look at is that potential rapture, which I believe happens on that October 2nd and 3rd, 2027 date. We don't know the day or the hour or the minute. We get it, but we do have to look at what he's trying to explain to us and come up with some gauge to when this is happening. And he always follows the Jewish calendars, just as the blood moons seem to always fall on the Jewish calendar dates and festivals and holidays. I believe this will also occur on these festivals and holidays, as he tells us in the Torah and other things that they do. So if we look at the Feast of Trumpets, which is October 2nd and 3rd of 2027, we got to work that back into these 4 dates that he gives us. Those 1260, 1290, 1335, and the 2300 days. Why do we do that? Because in Daniel 9, 8, and 12, he gives us these demarcation things. He explains what these things mean. Just like the 1290 in Daniel 12. If you look at this, and a lot of people don't understand what he means by these 1290. He says that by the time you take the continual burnt offerings away, and he sets up abomination, there shall be 1,290 days. So we know abomination is 1,260 days. So by the time when he signs that treaty, the Treaty of the Nations, with the covenant of death, this will start tribulation. This is the demarcation time between the sorrows of birth, pains, and tribulation. This will start the tribulation period. If people are saying that they're in tribulation right now, they don't know the Bible well enough to tell you what is going on down here, because there is a specific demarcation time between the sorrows, tribulation, and great tribulation, and why these 1260, 1290, 1335, and 2300 days matter. So we know from the time he signs that treaty, it's 1,260 days to abomination, and then he overtakes the 2 witnesses, and they lay in the street for 3.5 days before they're resurrected. So we know abomination is 1,260 days after that signing. But he says something extremely important, Daniel 12. He says, when the continuous burnt offerings are taken away and the abomination is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Well, there's a 30-day period prior to the start of the signing of the treaty and the 1260 to abomination. That's why I said most people aren't reading these things properly, and so they're overlapping and say, well, the 1260 happens and then the 1290, so that must be 30 days afterwards, and then we get to the 1335. Well, that's not what he's saying here. And that's why these four lines don't radiate at one starting point and go forward, because he's telling you there's specific things that are happening within these four time frames. One is abomination, which is 1260. The second one is 1290, from the 30 days of the stopping of the continual burnt offerings to abomination. And then he talks about the 1335 days. So we know the Gentiles trample the city for 1260 days, and then we have abomination, and he shortens the second half. And God tells us that you're a special person if you make it to the 1335 days. So that's 75 days after abomination. And what's really interesting is Yom Kippur was when the first seal was broke. But then if you work this back, you realize you start to see all these Jewish calendar events pop up. You see the Yom Kippur, you see Passover, you see the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, all fall within these time frames that he's giving you. And so this 1335 days is from the signing of the covenant of death through the 1260, and then you add the 75 additional days to the end. And what's really interesting is if you go to that Feast of Trumpets rapture event, which I keep talking about, if you work that back 1335 days, that ends up on April 20th of 2024. But 30 days prior to that would be February 5th of 2024. So you've got that small gap in there. But if you take the 2,300 days and move that from abomination all the way back to today, or towards, towards today in our time frame, because it goes from the end to the time of the beginning of the sorrows, or within the sorrows, you'll realize that from that time frame you'll go back to April 1st of 2021, which is Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is really interesting because that blood moon that wasn't supposed to happen, or is happening tonight, isn't supposed to happen until April of 2021. So that's sort of a coincidence I thought was sort of interesting, that maybe this 2,300 days starts in that Passover event on April 1st of 2021, and that by the time we get through this calendar of events and we hit the Feast of Trumpets on October 2nd and 3rd of 2027, we can start to see how these four date events occur and why they matter. And if you look at that, you'll see that he shortens that second half, but then we have the 7 bowls, or the 1 hour of God. Everybody talks about the hour of God and the bowls being dropped down, and I keep telling people, if you break this into the Hebrew calendar of 1,000 years and times that times the 360 days of the Hebrew Jewish calendar, that's 360,000 days, and you divide that, you got to reverse it back again, divide it by 1,000. That gives you 360 days in a year, and then you divide that by 24 hours in a day, and that would then actually give you 15 days as 1 hour on this earth in God's time frame. So that's important, because if you go from the Feast of Trumpets on that October 2nd and 3rd 2027 date, that October 2nd date, to the Feast of Tabernacles, which was on October 16th and 17th of 2027. Between those outer limits, the 2nd of October and the 17th of October, you would have a 15-day period, or 1 hour of God. So when you hear these 1 hour of God, or silence for a half an hour. You know that a half an hour is about 7.5 days, an hour is about 15 days, and that this is important within the calendar so that we can see these dates and how they line up with the Hebrew calendar. Is extremely important. And then, like I say, these demarcation periods between the sorrows, tribulation, and Great Tribulation are extremely important. Sorrows starts from the breaking of the first seal to the signing of the covenant of death, because then you have tribulation, which runs 1260 days, and then he has abomination, which then would be the demarcation period between Great Tribulation. And Great Tribulation would run from abomination to the end of the bowls, which is the seventh bowl, where God pours out the seventh bowl in the air, cleanses and re-ferments the planet, and then brings his bride back onto the planet in Jerusalem and reunites his kingdom with earth. So it's important that we look at these different events, and like I said, I added a little commentary within the sorrows, birth pains, because you have to understand that once Erdogan broke that first seal on Yom Kippur on October 9th, he started a chain of events which is going to bring on Daniel 8, the Goat War, which I believe is, I call it the sixth, or the Seals War, because it happens between the first seal and the sixth seal when Erdogan invades Syria, does Daniel 8, gains his Ottoman crown, collects 10 nations, goes through the Middle East into Africa, is then pulled back up into Israel, and then attacks Israel and dies on the sixth seal, is buried for 7 months. We see that selection of the 144,000 on the seventh seal. We see 4 trumpets sound, which devastate a third of the planet, and I believe that happens in the communist areas. And then from that devastation, we see those 10 nations break into those 4 regions. The bottomless pit will open up. Antichrist rises. The false prophet rises on the sixth trumpet with the Antichrist. Then the little horn that comes out of these 4 regions subdues the other 3 regions and then absorbs them all, and that is that diversified 4th kingdom, or the beast kingdom that everybody talks about. And even though this is happening in this epicenter of these 10 horn nations, or the Middle East, it is going to affect the whole world. This sixth seal event affects the whole world. It changes everything. It gives you earthquakes, and it throws islands, and it changes the sky. And as he's raining hailstone down on Gog's armies and in 10 nations, and we're watching the 4 horsemen gallop prior to this, as we're starting to see now. And like I say, if you look at that October 9th event from 2019 to where we are today, look what's happened. You know, Erdogan went into Syria and everything went downhill from there. We've had coronavirus. We're starting to have a global meltdown, and yes, it is starting to come back up a little, but that isn't going to last. And this is a long durational event. It's going to take years to fix this problem. And if it is a problem, I would love to see it be a biblical problem, because it has a good end, because if it doesn't, then it could just be bad and ugly without a good end. So hopefully it's a biblical thing if that is the case. I think if we look at this calendar, you can see the dates, you can start to see things appear in front of you, you'll know that things are happening. But we also need to understand what the sorrows, tribulation, and Great Tribulation are, and how Daniel 8:12 and Psalm 90:10 work together, and how these dates move back and forth. And you have to look how he states these days. You know, when he says, when he stops the continual burnt offerings, and that's 1290 days to abomination, well, you should know, if you know anything about the Bible, that abomination is from the signing of that 7-year covenant to abomination is 1260. So there's a 30-day beginning point where he stops those sacrifices up here, and then we walk into that tribulation period. The tribulation doesn't start until that signing of that covenant. And once that happens, then we are in tribulation. And once abomination occurs, then we're in Great Tribulation. And so once I think you start to see what these things really mean, and you don't bleed them together, and that's where a lot of people want to make a mistake. They want to take the sixth seal event, which is the sorrow event, and they want to shove it into tribulation or Great Tribulation down here somewhere. Well, if you look at Revelation 8, 1 and 2, I believe, it tells you once the seven seals are broken, then he hands out the seven trumpets. And so we know that the seven seals are broken at that point. And so you can't take a sixth seal event and push it over into this 1260 days or tribulation or Great Tribulation, because those two verses alone discredit that teaching. So I wanted to show you this. I think it's important that we understand these dates, how they line up, how they work with the Jewish calendar. And like I say, you know, quick synopsis, if Yom Kippur was the first seal and Erdogan broke it on October 9th, we're going to see within the next year a ramping up of a lot of events. Everything from global meltdown, we're going to have these birth contractions and events, and we're going to see a little pause, and then it's going to get worse again, and it's just going to continuously get worse. And as this starts to melt down, we'll see this Daniel 8 effect. You'll see those 10 nations form. You'll see Erdogan become the new Ottoman emperor. You will see him destroyed on the sixth seal, and that will then start taking us into that trumpet phase. But this is all part of the sorrows. And that does not end. These birth waves do not end. They do not stop until that signing of that covenant of death. And so if you take a sixth seal war and 4 trumpets to devastate a third of the planet, and it's mainly epicentered in the Middle East, it's not just going to affect the Middle East. It's going to affect the planet. So this is going to be a global thing. Economically, it's going to affect the globe. You know, all these things are going to affect us. We may not be in the Middle East, but we will be affected by this judgment, and all people will be judged by God. All nations, all institutions, everything will be judged, and he will break us all down until we submit to him, repent to him, and realize that the only door is through his son Jesus our Lord. And God bless everyone, and thank you for listening. Hopefully this makes sense. I do believe that time is short, and so as we move into this next year and this starts to ramp up, we will see Erdogan start to move. And when he starts to drive these Kurds out of Iraq and Syria into Iran's court, then probably Daniel 8 prophecy is going to happen within the next year. And that's why I said that April 1st, 2021 date is extremely important, because I believe that is when that 2300 days starts, and that will radiate down through to abomination. And it's amazing that that super blood moon that we know is happening is going to happen in April of 2021. The date that is indicated on the calendar is sort of an interesting coincidence, and we'll just have to see how all that pans out. But do be safe out there. God bless you all. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try to answer them the best you can. I will leave links in the descriptions, and hopefully this makes sense. You have a great night. Thank you.